What if everything you were taught about one of North America's most powerful indigenous nations was built on assumption? What if the real story of the Cree people stretches back so far, runs so deep, and carries so many secrets? What if even modern science is still catching up to what they always knew? Before we go any further, if you've ever wondered about the hidden roots of human history, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss a discovery like this, and share this video with someone who loves real, untold history. This is the kind of content that changes how you see the world. Now let's talk about the Cree. Most people, when they hear the word Cree, think of a group of indigenous people spread across Canada. They might picture trappers, hunters, people connected to the fur trade, people who survived colonization. And all of that is true, but it is only the surface. It is the thin top layer of something that goes incredibly deep, something that scientists, historians, and even many Cree communities themselves are only now beginning to fully understand. For centuries, outsiders tried to define the Cree. Explorers wrote about them, and missionaries tried to convert them. Governments tried to control them, and anthropologists tried to categorize them. And in all of that, a simplified version of the Cree story was created, one that fit neatly into textbooks and colonial records. One that made the Cree seem like a people who simply appeared, spread across the land, and lived in relative isolation. It made it seem like they lived that way until European contact changed everything. But ancient DNA does not care about textbooks. It does not care about colonial records or convenient narratives. It speaks a language older than any written word. And what it has begun to say about the Cree is quietly rewriting everything. It is also rewriting the deeper human history of North America. Let's start from the beginning. Not the beginning that most history books use, but the real beginning. The land we now call North America was not empty before the Cree. It was not a blank canvas waiting for human footprints. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before any written language existed anywhere on Earth, people were already here. They had crossed from Asia through what scientists call Beringia. Beringia was a massive landmass that once connected Siberia to Alaska during periods of lower sea levels. These were not primitive wanderers. They were skilled, adaptive, deeply intelligent human beings. They were people who knew how to survive in extreme conditions. For a long time, scientists believed this migration happened in a single wave. One group of people crossed, spread south, and eventually became the ancestors of all indigenous peoples. It was a clean story, easy to explain, easy to accept. Ancient DNA shattered that story. Research published in the last decade has revealed something far more complex. Multiple migration events have been discovered. Populations diverged, separated, reconnected, and mixed in ways that modern borders and ethnic categories cannot contain. The picture that emerges from ancient genomes is not a straight line. It is a web, an intricate, dynamic, thousands of years long web of human movement and human connection. And the Cree sit right at the center of one of the most fascinating parts of that web. Here is what we know. The ancestors of the Cree did not simply arrive and stay put. Here is what we know. The ancestors of the Cree did not simply arrive and stay put. The genetic data shows that the populations who would eventually become the Cree carried within them layers of ancestry. These layers reflect different streams of ancient migration. Some of this ancestry connects to the earliest known people in North America. Some of it reflects later movements and mixing events that occurred thousands of years after the initial crossings. What this means is profound. The Cree are not a young people in any meaningful sense. Their roots do not begin with the fur trade. They do not begin with European contact. They do not even begin with the most recent cultural forms we associate with Cree identity today. Their biological and cultural ancestry reaches back to some of the earliest chapters of human life. But let's go even deeper, because this is where it gets truly extraordinary. For years, researchers assumed that the populations living in the subarctic and boreal forest regions were relatively isolated. The thinking was that these areas were harsh and sparsely populated. Researchers thought the people who lived there had limited contact with groups further south or further west. Distance was supposed to mean separation. Geography was supposed to mean isolation. Ancient DNA said otherwise. What the genetic evidence has shown is that there were significant connections, ancient connections between populations. These connections occurred across enormous distances. Groups that lived in what is now the interior of Canada shared ancestry with populations much further afield. There were movements of people and exchanges of genetic material that happened over thousands of years. This happened in ways that no one had predicted. This is not just a scientific curiosity. This is a fundamental shift in how we understand Indigenous history. It tells us that the people of this continent were not isolated pockets of humanity waiting to be discovered. They were participants in a long, dynamic, continent-wide human story. They traded, they traveled, and they intermarried. They built relationships across vast distances. The Cree and the peoples who came before them were part of something far larger. They were more interconnected than the colonial narrative ever admitted. And there is something else the DNA is revealing. They traded, they traveled, and they intermarried. They built relationships across vast distances. The Cree and the peoples who came before them were part of something far larger. They were more interconnected than the colonial narrative ever admitted. And there is something else the DNA is revealing, something that speaks directly to the deep time depth of Cree identity. One of the most significant findings in recent research involves what scientists call population continuity. This refers to evidence that the same genetic lineage has been present in a particular region for an extremely long time. This presence existed without major replacement. In other words, the people were not swept away and replaced by newcomers. They stayed, they persisted, they adapted, and their descendants are still there. For the Cree and for related northern peoples, the evidence of deep continuity is striking. The genetic signatures found in ancient remains connect directly to living Cree populations. This suggests unbroken presence spanning thousands of years. This is not a population that was displaced and then repopulated. This is a lineage that held on. Think about what that means. Think about the ice ages and the dramatic climate shifts. Think about the massive environmental changes that swept across North America over the last 10,000 years. This is not a population that was displaced and then repopulated. This is a lineage that held on. Think about what that means. Think about the ice ages and the dramatic climate shifts. Think about the massive environmental changes that swept across North America over the last 10,000 years. Through all of that, through warming periods and cooling periods, the ancestral Cree populations persisted. Through the disappearance of megafauna and the transformation of ecosystems, they remained. They were not passive survivors. They were active, intelligent, highly adaptive human communities who read the land. They understood change and they endured. That is not weakness. That is one of the most extraordinary examples of human resilience. It is an amazing part of the entire archaeological record. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean for how we understand Cree culture and identity? Because DNA is one thing, culture is another. And the Cree are a people with an extraordinarily rich cultural identity, one that includes language, ceremony, oral tradition, and relationship with the land. They have a deep spiritual cosmology that does not fit neatly into Western scientific frameworks. Here is where the conversation becomes both more complex and more important. The Cree people have always carried their own account of who they are and where they come from. Their oral traditions, passed down across uncountable generations, speak to a deep relationship with the land. They speak to a relationship with the living world around them. They have never needed outside science to tell them that they belong here. They knew their roots were ancient and that they were not newcomers to this continent. They knew. They have always known. What ancient DNA does, when it is done with respect and community involvement, is provide a different kind of evidence. This evidence can sit alongside Indigenous knowledge rather than replacing it. The science does not own the story. The Cree own the story. The science simply offers another layer of detail and another way of seeing. It offers another confirmation of something that was never actually in question for the people themselves. But for the wider world, that scientific confirmation matters enormously. It matters for textbooks, institutions, governments, the courts, and public discourse. Because for too long, Indigenous peoples were treated as if their own knowledge was less valid. This was in comparison to what outside scholars said about them. Ancient DNA is helping to dismantle that hierarchy. It is happening slowly and imperfectly, but meaningfully. Now let's talk about something that has surprised even the scientists involved in this research. It is the question of just how early human presence in the Cree homeland might actually be. We already know that humans have been in North America for at least 15,000 years, possibly significantly longer. Some evidence suggests that occupation of the northern boreal regions may have a much older history. This is a history older than previously recognized. As the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, land opened up. And it appears that people moved into that newly available territory relatively quickly. They did not move slowly or cautiously, but with confident movement. They were populations who knew how to read the land and survive in harsh conditions. The genetic diversity found in ancient remains points to populations that were already well established. They were already complex and already differentiated from other groups. They were not brand new arrivals fumbling into unfamiliar territory. This changes the timeline dramatically. Combine this with evidence of deep continuity and the same ancestral lines persisting for thousands of years. What emerges is a picture of the Cree homeland as a place with a long, continuous history. It has one of the longest continuous histories of human habitation in North America. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. That is the kind of historical depth that commands respect. And here you are, still watching, still learning, and choosing to spend your time with real history. That means something. So here is a challenge for you. Right now, pause for just 2 seconds. Drop the word Cree in the comments below. No explanation needed. Just that one word. It will tell me you are the kind of person who is genuinely here for the truth. It will help this video reach more people who need to hear it. Go ahead. It'll wait. Good. Let's keep going. There's another dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and that is the question of language. The Cree language complex is one of the most widely spoken indigenous languages in North America. It is an Algonquian language, part of a family that stretches across a vast swath of the continent. It reaches from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Linguists recognize that these languages share a common ancestor deep in the past. Reconstructing that proto-language has been a major area of academic debate. Some researchers argued for an Eastern origin, while others pointed further west or north. What is fascinating is how the new genetic data interacts with this linguistic puzzle. Because language and genes do not always travel together. People can adopt new languages without changing their genetic ancestry, and vice versa. But when they do align, it suggests something powerful: real, sustained population movement. This is real, deep human history, written simultaneously in DNA and in words. The genetic evidence for deep connectivity aligns with the geographic spread of Algonquian languages. It suggests the cultural and biological history of the Cree may be even more intertwined. The language itself carries echoes of ancient journeys and ancient connections. It carries ancient ways of knowing the world. Language is not just communication. Among the Cree, language is memory. It is relationship. It is a living record of thousands of years of human experience. It is encoded in grammar, vocabulary, and the way a sentence is built. When a Cree elder speaks in their language about the land, they are not just describing geography. They are reciting a history that goes back further than most people can comfortably imagine. And now, ancient DNA is beginning to confirm just how far back that history goes. Let's talk about some of the specific findings that have come out of recent research. This is where the science gets genuinely remarkable. Studies examining ancient DNA from burials and sites across the Canadian Shield have been conducted. They have found genetic signatures that link directly to populations ancestral to the Cree. These are not vague similarities. These are specific, identifiable haplogroups. They are markers passed down that trace a clear biological thread from ancient individuals to living communities. Some of these ancient remains date back thousands of years. The genetic connection between them and modern Cree populations is not ambiguous. It is clear. It is direct. It is the kind of finding that silences debate about whether the Cree were always here. They were. What is equally important is the implication of this for land rights and sovereignty. It matters for the political and legal struggles that Cree communities continue to face today. Because history is never just history. History is power. History is argument. It is the foundation for legal claims and treaty negotiations. When ancient DNA confirms the Cree have been in their homelands for thousands of years, that is evidence. They were not migrants or recent arrivals, but deeply rooted, continuously present peoples. That is evidence that carries weight in courts and in political debates. It carries weight in international forums about Indigenous rights. The science is catching up to what the Cree have always asserted. And the world, slowly and reluctantly, is being forced to listen. Now let's talk about something that makes this story even more layered. The combination of DNA, archaeology, and oral history begins to illuminate things genetics cannot. The Cree, across their history, have demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Their territory spans an extraordinary range of environments, from the boreal forests of Ontario and Manitoba to the tundra edges of northern Quebec. Different Cree communities developed different subsistence strategies and seasonal patterns. They developed different relationships with specific animals, plants, and waterways. This geographic spread might seem to suggest the Cree are a loose collection of unrelated groups. Some scholars argued Cree was a European imposition to group diverse people, but the genetic evidence complicates that argument in interesting ways. While there is diversity within the profile, there are also patterns of shared ancestry. This suggests these communities were never as isolated from each other as distances might imply. The Cree were connected. They maintained relationships across vast distances. They shared ancestry, but they also shared a sense of collective identity. They shared a set of values and ways of being that persisted across geography and time. This is the part that pure genetics cannot fully capture. The DNA tells you where people moved and how they were related, but it cannot tell you why. It cannot tell you about the obligations people felt to distant relatives. It cannot tell you about the trade networks that carried not just goods, but ideas. It cannot tell you about the ceremonies and stories that created connection across the forest. For that, you need the stories, you need the elders, you need the languages, you need the traditions that were nearly destroyed by colonial policies. Policies like residential schools, forced relocations, and the deliberate suppression of culture. These are now being revitalized with fierce, determined effort by Cree communities. The survival of Cree culture is not separate from the genetic story. It is part of the same remarkable narrative of persistence. Just as the genetic line held on through ice ages, the cultural line held on through violence. Both kinds of survival are extraordinary. Both demand recognition. And here's the final dimension of this story that I want you to sit with for a moment. We live in a world that is obsessed with origins. Who was here first? Who has the longest claim? Whose story is the most ancient? These are questions that often get weaponized to justify or deny rights. They are used to elevate some histories and diminish others. But the story ancient DNA is telling about the Cree is not about superiority or competition. It is a story about depth and about connection. It is about what it means to truly belong to a place as a biological and cultural reality. The Cree belong to their land in a way that goes so deep and so far back. It goes into the geological and spiritual fabric of this continent. The concept of ownership almost feels absurd in comparison. You do not own something you are woven into. You are part of it, and it is part of you. That is what the DNA is showing. That is what the languages are saying. That is what the oral traditions have always insisted. And that is what the archaeological record continues to confirm. The Cree were never what we thought, because what we thought was always too small. It was too simple and shaped by the limited imagination of people looking from the outside. The reality is ancient. It is complex. It is beautiful. And it is still unfolding. Scientists are still sequencing ancient genomes, and elders are still teaching. Young Cree people are still learning their languages and reclaiming their ceremonies. They are asserting their sovereignty and standing on land their ancestors walked. They walked this land for thousands of years before the word Canada existed. The truth was always there in the land, in the language, and in the blood. Ancient DNA just gave the rest of the world one more reason to finally pay attention. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough to change the conversation. Before you go, I want you to do one last thing besides liking and subscribing. I want you to think of one person in your life, a friend, a family member, or a colleague. Think of someone who thinks history is boring or irrelevant. Send them this video and tell them it will change how they think about the world. Because it will. The history of human beings on this continent is a great story. It deserves to be told right. Share it right now. Let's make sure more people hear it.